Let me go to Photoshop. Like I said, I use Photoshop CC, where they make you pay all the time, but it's actually not a bad system. I've gotten some recent updates that have worked out pretty good. Oh, it's Photoshop CC. It's a you don't buy it for your computer. You essentially download it, and then you pay per month for the. I think the version I got it's $9.99, and you get Photoshop and Lightroom as part of the package. You pay per month, or I pay once a year, and they. Every few weeks you have to be online with your computer because it checks to make sure you've paid your bill. Because oftentimes if it can't check or if you don't pay your bill, the Photoshop won't open. And so I think that got a lot of people mad because you can't buy Photoshop and just install it in your computer anymore. It's an odd system that they have. I worried about it because I travel to a lot of places where I often don't have internet for many days in a row or at all. And so I usually, before I go on a trip, I check to make sure that I'm paid up. And you could manually have Adobe check your account to make sure that it's paid up.
But if you're paid up, why do they got to check if you're paid up? Don't they have records?
Well, if you pay, there's a monthly installment where you pay every month.
But you paid already for the year.
I know, you pay every year, so if you pay for a whole year, they only check every 3 months or so, which is fine.
Why do they have to check?
Because you could have installed it in 10 computers.
Yeah, because they want to make sure that the computer that you've installed it in is the one that you said that you installed it in. Instead of, because I could install it in your computer and then you could say, oh, this is great, I got a free copy of Photoshop. But then they'll check and they'll say, well, this is not the computer that Stan had bought the Photoshop version for.
How good a processing program do you need to do stuff like this? Basic, intermediate, top of the line?
Yeah. What kind of processing do you need? I use Photoshop. That's what I'm used to. You really need sort of a basic, probably Photoshop Elements would be good enough. I don't use very many of the tools in Photoshop because that's just what I'm used to as a news photographer, not really altering the image very much. But also, it's for most of this, if you have a really good exposure out of the camera, you don't really need to do too much in Photoshop itself. Because if you have to do too much, then you don't have a good picture to start out with. That's my feeling. I think that's the view of a lot of people, that the more you work on a picture, the worse it'll get, because you keep trying to improve one part and then another part will look not as good. Then you try to improve that and then the first part won't look so great. And then now you've really screwed up your picture.
I know some of the programs like in Elements, they'll do like this automatic processing for you.
Yeah.
Which doesn't really work.
No.
So, you have to play with it.
Yeah. You don't want to do any kind of automatic type work. Occasionally, like I'll show on a couple of these things, it sometimes work if you're just shooting the sky or if there's not much detail in the landscape elements. But generally, I like to keep it as simple as possible and try to do as little as I can to the actual image.
I think Photoshop Elements is also an app. It's not an online thing.
Right. Yeah, I think you can actually get it installed. And there's another intermediate version of Photoshop too it's sort of in between the full Photoshop version and Elements, I think. And then there's Lightroom, which a lot of people use. And
Pixel Measure, I think so.
Right. Yeah. I think any kind of program where you could lighten or darken the image, adjust the color balance. If you could adjust specific parts of the picture, that's very good. That's what you need. A lot of what I do with the night sky images is basically adjusting exposure and the color balance, because those are the two things that affect the way that people look at pictures. If you see a picture and it's too bright or too dark, that's really readily apparent. People will notice that. And if the color is off, that's the thing that people notice quite a bit too. So if you actually have the exposure and the color set pretty good, you're really most of the way there. I'll show you this one. I'll first start out with the JPEG as if you started out with a JPEG setting. And whoops, this is, let me pick out the one that we were looking at earlier. Let's see, I think this is it. Yeah, and this picture is mainly,
We're looking at the
oh,
power sheet.
let's see. I wonder if there's a, oh, duplicate. There we go. All right, here we go. When the moon's not out, you could get, basically the landscape is more or less a silhouette. The foreground is very dark. You could get some nice trees. One thing I didn't talk about much is composition, and that's another thing that that you could work on in terms of if you look at regular daytime landscape pictures. A lot of effort is put into the composition of where things are in the picture, where the horizon is, where the sky is. Of course, with a lot of the night pictures that I take, sky is a pretty big element, and so you could use a lot of different elements in the ground on the landscape to do things like frame the picture. I use this large tree here on the corner of the picture to frame the sky that had the Milky Way here. What I do when I open up in Photoshop, I also have a set of what's called actions, and they're basically shortcuts. You could set these up for all the different features that you use. So I generally go down this list and use the different features, and then end up with the save as command. And the other thing I open up are layers, which often helps with the star trail pictures. And then the box called Info, which is found under the Window menu item. There's a lot. You see the actions here. You see Info. You see Layers. Info is very helpful. Wherever you put your cursor, I'll move the cursor around, and you look at this box in the lower right-hand corner of the picture, and you see the numbers changing as I move it around. What it's showing you is numbers right next to R, G, and B, which is the red, green, and blue components of the picture. And so it shows you, I'll try to put it right on this. This is actually another photographer taking pictures using her red light, which was pretty nice. So I put it on the red there, and you see the red readout is 244, and the green and blue are much less. So there's quite a bit of red there. But then I move it up into the sky, and it evens out a little bit more. What I do is I look in the, you need to blow up the image, and then you look into the sky. If you put it on a star, you don't want to put your cursor on a star, because that's reading whatever color the star is. Most of the stars are white. There's often stars that are reddish or bluish in color, but that'll also give you a false reading for the sky. I like to make the sky itself a fairly neutral black, because oftentimes when you go out and you look up at the sky, to your eyes, it looks, well, very dark gray or black. It looks like a black sky at night. So I'll blow up the image pretty large and put the cursor, or try to put the cursor in a blank area of the sky. And sometimes sometimes it's fairly close. The closer these three numbers are to being the same, the closer that part of the picture is to being a neutral gray. In other words, more. And then if you darken that gray, you'll get a pretty nice black. And that, to me, that's the way that most people see the night sky, as just a fairly neutral gray or black. One thing you could do, if this is off by a large factor, and this part of the sky, the red says 25 and the green and blue say 36 and 35. So it's 10 points off, which is which is far enough to be slightly noticeable. What you could do is in levels, which is under image. Now I'll turn that off for a second. Under image, under adjustments, there's a command called levels, and that opens up a small box. And you see the histogram again. This will show you the histogram of this image, the same thing that's on the back of the camera. On the right side here are these three little eyedroppers, and the middle one is to determine the grayscale. It'll say sample image to get gray point. So if you click on that and you find a point and you click on that point, for that particular point, it'll set a gray point. In other words, it'll even out those three values, the red, green, and blue. If I often do that and then zoom back just to see what it's done to the picture. See, if I take that point, put it on the red, it'll try to make that red a gray point. And then you see the change in color here. It's trying to make that red gray, which then makes the sky some bizarre bluish color, and the rocks some strange color. So this picture is actually pretty close to being gray. You can see near the horizon, there's some haze along the horizon, which actually makes the white of the Milky Way a little bit reddish, orangish in color. And in the night sky, there's often a green glow. It's just called sky glow. It's certain atoms high up in the atmosphere tend to glow at a certain frequency, and a digital camera is quite sensitive because your eye doesn't see a lot of things because your eye is taking in information on a continuous basis. With the camera, like for this picture, for example, I've kept the shutter open for 30 seconds. So for 30 seconds, photons are coming in, it's taking in all sorts of information. So a lot of information is building up on the sensor that normally with a human eye you wouldn't be able to see. So you could do a gray point on different parts of the sky and just see what happens to the image. I usually do it somewhat near the edge so that you don't get a lot of contamination from down the haze down there. And another tool to use would be something called curves, which is on the same menu as the under image, under adjustments. There's levels right there, and then there's curves. Curves is a good way to adjust contrast. One thing you could do at the very bottom left-hand part of this line, if you click on that and you just pull it over to the right side, that darkens mainly the dark portions of the picture. As you can see, the lighter portions, like this part of the Milky Way, the light from the flashlight, don't really get darkened too much. And that'll, if your picture, oftentimes the pictures will appear a little flat when they come out of the camera of the night sky, and that's just a good way to increase the contrast a little bit. You could darken the sky a little bit, and if you go to the upper right-hand corner, that controls the light values. If you pull that over to the left, that'll mainly lighten the lighter values like stars. So you can actually play around with this curve quite a bit and adjust the contrast, mainly to darken the sky a little bit, and you bring out the Milky Way, the highlights of the Milky Way there.
So are you trying to eliminate this kind of greenish thing that's happening naturally in the atmosphere?
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I just leave it there. One way to adjust particular colors is it's still under the image setting on there. You go to adjustments, and you go to something called hue saturation, which is just on that same menu group, and you come up with a box that this will control the three main colors, the red, green, and blue, but also control the complementary colors, the yellow, cyan, and magenta in your image. So if something looks a little red or a little green, you can control that, and so you can go just straight to the green. And what saturation and lighten do is that they start to eliminate that particular color in your picture. For for this example, I'll go to red, and if you watch the red light from the flashlight, if you minus the saturation there and minus the light, and all of a sudden the red light starts to almost disappear. You also essentially get rid of a lot of haze in the sky there in the photo. In this particular picture, what you mainly end up though is with a black and white image, because you've pretty much eliminated the red from the flashlight there, and any subtle color in the sky that you see. One window that I always keep open as part of the actions is one called history. If you ever make a mistake in Photoshop, don't panic, because this history window will show you everything you've done up to that point. So I did the hue saturation, and I think, well, I overdid it there. I don't want to eliminate that much red. I just go back one step, and it erases whatever you've just done. The crop tool can be useful with your horizon. It often creates this grid, and many times my horizon isn't perfectly straight, although I try to get the horizon. It also depends on what you're shooting. The Grand Canyon is not the top of the Grand Canyon is not perfectly flat if you've seen it. It actually kind of goes at various different angles. So depending on which direction you're shooting at, if your camera is level, according to a level, the horizon itself might not be level. So this is the crop tool is a good tool to use. If you put the cursor on the outside, you can actually tilt the image one way or another. And I'll make an extreme example, and I'll show you. So now the image is tilted over, but if you needed to make a correction like that, the crop tool is a good way to do that.
Quick question.
Yes.
So this is just a single exposure. This isn't like stacked multiple exposures or anything.
No, this is just I'm showing you what works on a single exposure like this.
Is stacking a function of the program?
It's a function of several programs, and I'll go into that in a minute. The crop tool is also good, obviously, if you want to crop an image in any certain way. I try to do a lot of the composing in the camera itself, so that you don't have to do too much cropping outside of the camera itself. When you're completely done with the image, you could I work on it and get the version that I like, and then I save it. I usually save it in a separate folder than I keep the images in, and I save it as a TIFF file, which is at the very bottom of the whole group of ways you could save a file. A TIFF file doesn't compress it at all, but it also keeps the file size is whatever file size is open in Photoshop. So this image, this number down at the very bottom of the corner of the frame here shows you how big the file is that you've opened, and it says 103 megabytes. So that's the size of the TIFF file that will be saved to your computer. So it starts to take up a huge amount of space. The one thing I do recommend is you get an external hard drive, and when you've come home from a night of shooting, save everything that you've done to at least one external hard drive. I save it to two. I create duplicates of my files because that's all of my work. And if something happens to one of those hard drives, then a lot of my work is lost. So I save on two separate hard drives before I format, before I erase the camera disk and use it again. And
you're working in TIFF all the time, is that what you're doing?
Well, this I'm working on the JPEG picture. Once I've corrected the exposure and color, I'll save it as a TIFF, and that becomes my master file. So that's the file that I could use if I want to make a big print, or say I want to send the picture to someone, then I could open up the file, make a smaller JPEG, and do that if I wanted to.
I thought you're working in JPEG and then you save it to TIFF?
Then you save it as a TIFF file. Because if you save it as a JPEG again, it'll recompress the file, and you'll lose even more information. If you save it as a TIFF, it won't compress the file. It'll save it the way that you see it on the screen. And then you could save further files as a JPEG if you need to. If you need to send small files via email, or if you want to post something and just decrease the size, downsize the image itself.
I'm trying to understand the change. You're shooting in RAW.
Right.
You import it. You're not working at it in RAW, you're working at it in JPEG?
I opened up the JPEG because this is probably what most people are working on now. So I was going to do this version first and then do the RAW version second. So most people are probably used to working in a JPEG, and they're not used to seeing a RAW image open, which doesn't look that much different. But no matter which version you work in, once you get an image that you like, save it as a TIFF, because that's an uncompressed file, and that you could take that file and then you could save it as a JPEG later on if you need to do that. But you still have your master file, the TIFF file that you've initially saved. So if you needed to work on the RAW file, I'll use this version, because then I could show you. This was the Venus, Mars, and Jupiter up in the sky over Central Park. This is camera RAW, which is, I seem to have lost the top of the image, but so this is what you have kind of similar controls, but you've got a lot of leeway because you can alter a RAW file and then it won't change the initial information that's in there. So you can see that this is fairly, I've slightly overexposed this a little bit. You could actually bring down the exposure or bring up the exposure quite a bit. There's a great feature that was just introduced into Camera Raw. It's called dehaze. What it does is get rid of haze in a picture. It essentially gets rid of the yellow in the picture. But what you see is that it helps get rid of stuff like the really hazy clouds. It's getting rid of the yellow in the sky so that the more of the actual sky shows through. It's almost like this miracle tool where you suddenly start to see stars in the sky where you didn't see stars before. So you can overdo it. I mean, if you go way to this side, the sky starts to get really blue. I don't do it. I kind of go over a certain amount and then work on a little bit more in Photoshop.
Well, why don't you lose the yellow in the buildings as well?
Well, that I'll do when I'm correcting.
No, I'm saying when you did it for the sky, why didn't it do it for the buildings also?
Oh, it actually does. I mean, there's a fair amount there. I think somehow it's just altering a lot of what's in the sky. I've seen that before where it doesn't change the landscape part very much, but it changes the sky for some reason. And there's some tools up here that's similar to Photoshop tools. Here's a white balance tool where if you have something that's white in the actual picture.
Isn't this Photoshop also?
This is Photoshop too. This is I'm working on a RAW file. It's called Camera Raw. And so this is what it looks like if you open up a RAW file
In Photoshop.
In Photoshop, yeah. You get a little bit different interface, and you get a lot more controls on this side that you could deal with the image. What you could do also is you have a lot of control over the color temperature. If you know that at high noon the temperature of the light is 5,000 degrees Kelvin. And the tungsten light inside of say your house on a light bulb for a lamp is usually 3,200 degrees Kelvin or a lot lower. So it's a very, very yellowish in color. Daylight is a very sort of a neutral color. There are lots of lights that are very bluish in color. But you can change the color temperature so you can make the picture very yellow, or you can make it very, very blue. What you're also doing is also, if you look at the buildings, this affects the lights on the buildings because it's neutralizing the very yellowish color, or you can make it a lot yellow.
Is yellow 2700?
Well, a yellow tungsten light is rated at 3,200 degrees Kelvin. That's just a measurement of the light output. And so this, you could adjust this as you wish. I usually leave the actual gray part to the levels in Photoshop. So I'll open this. You could work on it in the camera raw setting, and then you open it in Photoshop itself. So I can go to the levels, go to the gray eyedropper again, and so depending on where you place this, it can become either gray, or with a New York City skyline, you often don't get a whole lot of gray. I'll come up to this part, and yeah, there's a little vignetting on this lens, and let's see. You can make a little further adjustments with curves. You can go to each color in curves, red, green, or blue. So, for example, if you want to get rid of a little bit more of the yellow, you can alter it in curves this way, and then also increase the contrast a little and make it darker, depending on how dark you like. So, as the sky gets a little darker, the planets and some of the stars start to show up a little bit more. So Jupiter's shining through the cloud here. Mars is right here in this relatively clear spot, and Venus is up here. And so there's each person, I think, has their own way of doing different things. And there's we discussed, there's a lot of different programs out there that you could use for pretty much a similar thing. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about using filters versus using Photoshop? I mean, is it like don't use filters on your camera anymore because you can just do it all in Photoshop? Or
well, if you can, this lens I can't use a filter on, as you could see. The front of that, you can't really put much on there. With a smaller lens, you could use a filter. The filter that I've always wanted to use is, I know with astrophotography through telescopes, there's something called a light pollution filter that's supposed to deal with a lot with.
But that turns everything green.
But then you could it's used for astrophotography, so you can adjust for that. What it does is get rid of a lot of the frequencies of the artificial light. Apparently they don't make them for camera lenses. They're not big enough for camera lenses. So, yeah, too expensive.
Why does it turn it green? Why doesn't it just darken the light?
No, it doesn't turn.
Yeah, I'm not really. I've actually not seen it.
Usually the one I use in Lincoln Center. There are different nebular filters we're talking about filters for astrophotography with the dedicated sensor shooting through a telescope. And what you do, you try to cut lights emitted from Earth and only let the lights from like a star coming in. And some of them turn things green, but you don't aim them to bright objects that you aim into a nebula, and it's not going to make it green, it's going to make it hot.
I'm just saying the moon turns green and Venus turns green.
You don't use the filter.
Yeah, depending on which filter you use. But what would be great is a light pollution filter that would get rid of light pollution. Then you'd be pretty good with the sky. For the night photography, there's so little light that you're dealing with that if you put a filter on, you're cutting the minuscule of light that you're getting anyway, and you're just cutting that by a huge amount. Filters are great during the daytime because you just have so much light out there, and there's not really much that you'd be filtering other than light pollution. If you're out in a wilderness area, there's really no artificial light going up into the sky like there is here in New York City, and there isn't much of a change in color that you would really need to see.
I don't understand the sort of electromagnetic spectrum good enough to know how they can filter out, Earth light versus, stellar light or whatever. But is that something you can address in Photoshop?
A little bit, like
the yellow haze thing?
Like the yellow haze, and then adjusting the yellow and the blue, because a lot of city lights are very yellow in color, yellow or reddish in color. So if you can control that, then you often can get rid of the various tints that you see in pictures that are taken near cities or towns. It'd be great if you could if all the lights were one particular frequency of the spectrum, that would be great, because if you then you could get a filter that just filters out that particular wavelength, and then you'd be good. But I would think, especially in a big city, there's all sorts of lights throwing out all sorts of different frequencies, and that just causes a lot of problems.
The new lights that they're installing all over the streets, is that also yellow or is that blue?
The new LED lights that they're installing on the street lights are very bluish in color, so that's just going to cause even more problems. If you've ever taken a picture inside of a house or a building where you're next to a window and there's artificial lights on, you see all sorts of wild colors in the picture and all that, and so it's a lot of stuff to deal with, especially if you're outdoors in a more or less uncontrolled environment. Let me just briefly show. There's a program called Star Stacks. You can actually do this in Photoshop as well. Under File, there's something called Scripts, and then you load files into a stack. What you're doing is actually you're trying to get all the files that make up a star trail picture, and so you find those. So here's the picture at Wupatki of the Pueblo site, and I choose all of those. I don't check any of the boxes here, and I just click OK. And then what it does is that in the layers window, it's just stacking all these layers in a big row, essentially making a pile of all of these images. And it takes a couple minutes for it to process. There's a couple of third-party programs that will do something similar to this as well. This actually might be covered in some of the other versions of Photoshop. So you have your layer window here, and these are all the different files. So if
But does Photoshop do it or not?
Oh, it does. I'm gonna show you. If you look at each of these individual pictures, if you look up into the sky, you'll see the stars moving. So these are 2-minute exposures taken 1 second apart. And you also see the shadow of on the wall moving up as time goes on. As the moon is setting, the shadow is going up. So you could make a time-lapse short movie out of this if you wanted to, and you'll see the stars moving around. And so these are all the images from individual images that make up this one star trail. If you select all of these images, there's 30 images here, and they're 2-minute exposures each. So that's 60 minutes worth of exposures. There's a pull-down window here that gives you this huge list of different commands, and one is called Lighten. You click on Lighten, you got your star trail image there. What it's doing is combining just the lighter portions of each picture onto the base picture, so that each image that I just scrolled through on that sequence of pictures was a part of each arc on the star trail.
The command was lightning?
The command is called Lighten. It's along here. It's just a little window that you it pulls down all sorts of different commands, and it's called Lighten. And then that creates the star trails. And then you could work on this. What you need to do is I would advise saving this you could save it as a Photoshop file. And what that does, that's at the top of this list. A Photoshop file saves this entire stack without altering it all. And you could actually go into each layer and make adjustments if you need to. But what you have is your original stack all in one place. This is a pretty huge file. I think it's 1.35 gigs. So you're talking about just massive amount of space now, but computers nowadays have much bigger memories, and you've got hard drives. So save this right to a hard drive. Save the Photoshop file to a hard drive before you do any more work on it. To make this a more reasonable file to work on, you go to the Layers command, and right toward the bottom is one called, there's various commands you could do when you have layers, and one is called flatten image. What it'll do is it'll do just that. It'll flatten all of these, all the different layers into one. So now you have a 46 meg file, which is the original size of each individual file coming out of my camera. And now you could crop this image however way you want it, and you could also lighten, darken, change the color. There's probably not too much. You could just select the sky if you want and darken that, and then you save this file. Once you're done with however way you want it to look, you could save this as a TIFF. That becomes your master file that you store away someplace. And you could then, if you want to send this to somebody, if you want to post this, you can make a smaller JPEG out of it and then post it. But you still have your original TIFF master file plus the original Photoshop with the Photoshop file with all the different layers on it. We're pretty close to the end now. I could take a few more questions and whatever anybody wants to talk about.
What software does that?
Oh, there's a software called, hang on, Peter. There's one called StarStax. It's STAR and a capital STA and a capital X. And all that does is it basically does that command separately from Photoshop. There's a box where you could drop all of your images, and then there'll be a command that just says to combine all the images, and it does exactly what we saw in Photoshop. You could save that particular file then as a TIFF, and then you can work on it in Photoshop. This is free, so the advantage of if you're software that you normally don't work on, if it can't combine the pictures into a star trail, you could get StarStax, and this is just a free software that'll do the whole imaging. Hang on a second, Peter had a.
How about like the one for the crescent moon? You had that cityscape one with the crescent moon, Venus, Jupiter, but when you have the crescent moon with the Earth shine on it, how are you exposing for that? Is that a single shot as well?
Yeah, essentially you're overexposing the lit portion, that little crescent portion of the moon. If you look closely at the picture, you don't see any detail, you don't see any craters in that. And that's how you get the Earth shine in a lot of pictures. It's hard to see you can see it okay from New York City. It's better if you go away from city lights. You see this great phenomenon when there's a very thin crescent moon, and you can actually see it probably best through binoculars. The unlit portion of the moon is being lit by light reflected off the Earth. It's called Earth shine. So the sun is hitting the Earth, and that light is being reflected toward the moon, and then that light comes back toward us. And if you to photograph that, you basically just have to overexpose that one crescent part of the moon, which isn't too hard. It just takes a little bit of experimentation, and you get the crescent, and you see sort of a shadowy portion of that unlit portion of the moon. That's the Earth shine. You could see a little bit of details of the craters and the larger seas on the moon. It's a really great image to make it. Yes?
When you stack those photos, that's easy to see with the star trails. What happened on the floor? You had that moving shadow or the moving bright spot?
Right.
What did it do? Combine?
Yeah, what happens is that this lit portion was actually just essentially a door about this size. So initially it started out as that big, and you can see as time goes on that the light, the moonlight through that doorway creeps across the floor like that. And when you combine that, all the lit portions are combined. You could do this. You can actually create an image where it's just this and the star trails by combining it manually. You could do it manually in Photoshop. What I showed you that was this automated system. You could stack them manually, and with 30 images, it's not that much. I've done it with as many as a couple of hundred over a several hour exposure, and that's a lot of manual labor. That's a lot of work doing that. But you could actually do that and retain just the one light portion if you want. I just ended up doing that, and then once I got done, I realized what had happened. And I thought, well, that doesn't look too bad. It looks interesting. You see a little bit more detail in the floor there. And so I just kept it that way.
It's S-T-A-R-S-T-A-C-K?
S-T-A-R and then S-T-A-X.
X?
X.
X.
Yes, a big X. And that's free, and so that if you, I'm not sure how extensive something like Photoshop Elements is. If you use that, you might be able to have star stacks, and then you could do the star trails that way. Well, thanks a lot. Oh, another question? Sure.
This is kind of a general question, but can we talk, I mean, I know the media has changed so much that we're experiencing these photographs now hardly ever on print.
Right.
It always seems to be on a phone or a
Right.
laptop or.
Oh yeah.
What's your feeling about that? And versus having like 50 megapixels and or 50 megabytes of resolution. If you put something on the side of the building, I can see it. But are we to a point where we're just diminishing return in terms of the ability to take these very large files with really high resolution that you'll never see on the screen?
Yeah, the question is just about the resolution of cameras, and everything we see is electronic now. We see it on our. I mean, I hate to show people pictures on my phone because here's the size of the screen versus that screen. So it's a little embarrassing to show like some of the star pictures on a phone like this, and like the using a camera like a D800 to show pictures on a phone is probably a little bit of overkill because the resolution is so high. I do it because this is what I do for my living, and my plan is to do more gallery shows to make large prints. So I really need that resolution. There is a point where you probably have too much resolution, but then you also have the quality that goes along with that. Most of the cameras don't have this much resolution in it. It's closer to the Sony. Closer. I don't really pay attention to the megapixels because they don't really mean anything. But I think an average camera might have around 20 megapixels or so nowadays, and that's plenty for what you need, and probably plenty for even as big as if you were going to make a 16 by 20 or 20 by 30 inch print. As long as you're not cropping in very much on the picture. The smaller your file, of course, the worse it'll get. And everything is pretty much seen electronically. You don't really need too much resolution to see an image, any kind of image on a computer screen or on a phone nowadays or on a tablet. The great thing I think about a lot of the digital SLRs is you could start out with a pretty good sized file with a high quality and then adjust it down. You never want to be going from a small file and trying to adjust it up if you do want to make a big print or if you want to make a big presentation on a big screen. So in that sense, there's not too much. The only people like me would spend a lot of money for a bigger camera. For most people, this camera would be, it's too much to spend on a camera where you could spend some of that money on, say, a better lens for the camera that you have. I like it because it's worked a lot. It works at some of the really extreme high ISOs with very little noise, and it gets the quality that I need for the work that I do. But I mean, everybody has different needs. If you're just really looking at the pictures on, say, even just a website, the pictures on my website are pretty low in resolution, and they look perfectly fine, both on a computer and on something like a tablet or even on a screen like this size. So it kind of depends on what your eventual aim for your picture is going to be. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. So what do you look for in a lens such that you don't get aberrations at the corner of your image?
Yeah. I look for something that's people have reviewed it and said that this is a sharp lens that you could use for pictures of stars, because the worst thing to see is stars that are all sorts of odd shapes at the corner of your lenses, and unfortunately you really have to probably spend a fair amount of money, especially with the super wide angle lenses. With a full frame camera, you need a wide angle lens, and you just have to put the money into it. This is probably one of the sharper lenses that Nikon makes. The strange thing is that they have a 14 millimeter single focal length lens that isn't nearly as sharp as this lens. So the zoom lens is actually sharper, which is a little bit odd.
Which lens is that?
This is a 14 to 24 millimeter Nikon zoom. So it's got that range. I use it mostly at 14 millimeter because I like the wide view, the wide perspective of the lens.
And what model back is it?
The camera itself is a D800.
D800.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. And